Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to exploring the world of spiritual systems
Oh, yeah.
and specifically like how to tell if a system is, healthy or not.
Yeah.
Um, and also how to kind of look out for the ones that might not be serving their followers.
Right.
Um, we've got some really interesting source material for this one.
Yeah, this is a good one.
Yeah, we've got like academic research and a whole website about like a specific group. We've got some forum discussions, even some like personal blog posts.
Yeah, a lot of different angles on this one.
So yeah, it's going to be a wild ride. So like strap in.
It's funny, we often think of spiritual teachings as like eternal, you know,
Like,
unchanging, but they're actually quite dynamic.
Mhm.
Sometimes that evolution leads to, beautiful new insights, but other times it can get a little messy. And
Ah.
teachings can kind of become what researchers call like fossilized or crystallized.
Okay, so what does that even mean? Fossilized teachings.
Well, imagine like a shell on the beach, It was once part of a living creature, but now it's just a hardened form.
Right.
Spiritual teachings can go through a similar process. The initial spark of understanding can get buried under layers of rigid rules, rituals, interpretations.
That makes sense, but I'm guessing that's not really a good thing.
Right, when a teaching becomes fossilized, it loses its vitality. It loses its ability to adapt to changing circumstances. The emphasis shifts from inner transformation to outward conformity.
Mm.
You start to see a focus on blindly following the rules rather than understanding the principles behind them.
Okay, so that sounds like it could be pretty stifling.
Yeah.
So what are some signs that a system is like veering into that fossilized territory?
Well, one red flag is an over-veneration of leaders or groups,
Okay.
almost to the point of worship.
Right.
Healthy systems encourage critical thinking and questioning, even when it comes to those in authority.
So if I'm like feeling pressured to accept everything a leader says without question, that's a sign to maybe step back.
Exactly. And another sign is hostility towards other groups or traditions.
Hmm.
Genuine spiritual systems recognize the universality of truth.
Right.
They don't feel threatened by different perspectives.
Makes sense. I guess it's kind of like if a teaching is truly rooted in like wisdom and compassion,
Yeah,
it shouldn't need to like tear others down to prop itself up.
precisely.
Yeah.
You also want to watch out for a sense of fragmentation or impatience within the group itself.
Okay.
When a system is healthy, there's a sense of shared purpose and a willingness to work through disagreements constructively.
Yeah.
But when it starts to deteriorate, you see infighting, splintering, a loss of that original unifying spirit.
Interesting. And what about the teachings themselves? Can you tell if they've become fossilized just by looking at the content?
Sometimes, one clue is if a teaching becomes overly fixated on specific techniques or practices,
Okay.
applying them in a one-size-fits-all manner, regardless of individual needs or circumstances.
Right, because what works for one person might not work for everyone.
And-
And our needs can change over time, too.
Right.
So
Right.
flexibility is key.
Absolutely. Think of it like this. A doctor wouldn't prescribe the same medication to every patient, right?
Right.
They take into account individual circumstances and adjust the treatment accordingly.
Yeah.
It should be the same with spiritual teachings.
Makes sense.
They need to be adaptable and tailored to the individual.
That's a great analogy.
Hmm.
Speaking of individuals, our sources also talk about the dangers of mistaking external behavior for actual spiritual attainment.
Oh, yeah, that's a big
Can you
no.
elaborate on that a bit?
Of course. We live in a world that often values appearances over substance, and unfortunately, that tendency can seep into spiritual communities as well.
Right.
Some people might focus on meticulously following dietary rules,
Ah.
dressing a certain way, or using specific language,
Right.
but their inner life doesn't reflect those outward practices.
You know, it's interesting because that makes me think about how social media can sometimes create a culture of like performing spirituality
Yeah.
rather than actually embodying it. Have you noticed that as
Oh,
well?
absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so easy to get caught up in presenting a certain image. But true spiritual growth is about inner transformation, not outward conformity.
Right. It's about cultivating qualities like humility, compassion, self-control.
Yeah.
And those qualities are about aligning our like inner and outer worlds, not just projecting a certain image.
Exactly. And remember, those virtues aren't just about being a good person in society.
Yeah.
They actually serve a deeper purpose, promoting psychological integrity and leading to genuine inner peace and fulfillment.
So how can our listener avoid falling into the trap of mistaking external behavior for genuine spiritual development?
Yeah.
How can you tell if someone is walking the walk, so to speak?
That's a great question. It's not always easy, But I think it comes down to observing their actions over time.
Hmm.
Do their words align with their deeds?
Right.
Do they treat others with kindness and respect even when it's difficult?
Yeah.
Are they humble and willing to admit when they're wrong?
So it's about looking beyond the surface and paying attention to the deeper qualities they embody.
Exactly. It's about seeing the fruits of their practice in their daily life,
Hmm.
not just in their outward appearance or the things they say.
Okay, so we've talked about some general red flags to look out for, but now I'm curious to dive into a specific case study that illustrates some of these dangers.
Okay.
Our sources include some fascinating material about a group called the Science of Identity Foundation and its leader, Chris Butler.
That's where things get really interesting. We have a variety of perspectives on this group,
Yeah?
from official documents and news articles to personal accounts and forum discussions.
Yeah, our first source, databases001p.pdf, is like a dossier.
Oh, wow.
Accusations of cult-like behavior, a list of alleged members, and even details about political campaign contributions.
Wow.
It's a bit overwhelming, but it definitely raises some eyebrows about the group's influence and practices.
Yeah, it's certainly a lot to unpack. And then we have Iowa Czytanie Mission Polishite 00165.pdf, which digs into Butler's history, teachings, and controversies.
You know, it's important to understand the context surrounding this group and its leader.
Right, because context is everything. And we also have those personal blog posts by Jasper Leonard, who doesn't hold back in his criticism of Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation.
Yeah.
It seems like he had a pretty negative experience with the group.
Yeah, his accounts provide a firsthand perspective on the dynamics within the group, and some of his descriptions are quite concerning. It's important to consider these personal experiences alongside the more official documents and historical accounts.
So if we connect this back to our earlier conversation, what are some specific instances where those red flags, like over-venerating the leader and hostility towards other groups,
Right.
show up in the case of Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation?
Well, in one of his texts, Butler encourages his followers to focus their energy on self-criticism
Ah,
and to view themselves as lower than the straw in the street.
wow.
This emphasis on self-deprecation and dependence on the leader for validation raises concerns about potential manipulation and control. Wow, that's a pretty powerful image, lower than the straw in the street.
Yeah,
I'm guessing that kind of language can make people more susceptible to a leader's influence.
that's right. When someone is constantly told they are unworthy and incapable, they can become more reliant on the leader for guidance and validation.
Right.
This can create an unhealthy power dynamic where the follower's sense of self-worth becomes tied to their obedience to the leader.
And that's when things can start to go off the rails, right?
Exactly.
When critical thinking goes out the window and blind faith takes over.
It's crucial to remember that healthy spiritual systems encourage individuals to develop their own discernment and to question even those in positions of authority. Blind faith without critical thinking can be a slippery slope.
So how can we as individuals develop that critical thinking muscle when it comes to spiritual teachings and groups? It seems like that's a key theme emerging from this deep dive.
Absolutely. It's about being willing to ask tough questions, to consider multiple perspectives, and to trust our own intuition. If something feels off or doesn't sit right with us, we shouldn't be afraid to question it, even if it comes from a respected source.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think we've covered a lot of ground for now.
Yeah.
It's a lot to process, and I'm sure our listener has some things to think about already.
You're right. Let's take a break here, and when we come back, we'll explore the concept of limerence and how it plays into the dynamics of spiritual systems.
Okay, so we've been digging into what can go wrong in spiritual systems.
Right.
And I think it's really helpful to have these concrete examples
Yeah.
to kind of illustrate those red flags.
I agree. Real-world cases like the Science of Identity Foundation can give us a much deeper understanding of these dynamics.
Yeah, so before we jump back into that, there's this term that keeps popping up in our sources.
Okay.
Limerence.
Ah, yes.
It sounds like a fancy dessert,
Right.
but it's actually pretty serious stuff, right?
Definitely not a dessert.
Okay.
Limerence is that intense, almost obsessive infatuation we sometimes feel for another person. It's often described as like being head over heels in love,
Right.
but in a way that can really cloud our judgment.
And our source, traumabusecults.pdf, suggests that this kind of limerence plays a big role in how spiritual groups can become unhealthy.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, imagine you're drawn to a charismatic leader.
Okay.
You're inspired by their teachings, their presence, their whole vibe.
Right.
It's easy to start putting them on a pedestal
Yeah.
and overlooking any flaws or red flags.
You're so caught up in that feeling of like awe and inspiration
Yeah.
that you don't see the warning signs.
Exactly.
It's like being starstruck, but in a spiritual context.
Exactly. And that's where things can get tricky.
Right.
Because that state of limerence can make you more vulnerable to manipulation. You want to believe in this person, you want their approval, and you might be willing to do things you wouldn't normally do to maintain that connection.
That makes sense, and it's probably even more intense in a spiritual setting, where people are seeking meaning, purpose, and belonging.
Absolutely. People who are feeling lost or unfulfilled
Right.
are particularly susceptible to the allure of a charismatic leader who promises to guide them to enlightenment or fulfillment. They might be seeking something to fill a void in their lives, and this leader seems to offer that sense of completion.
But the problem is that feeling of completion is often based on external validation rather than genuine inner growth.
Exactly. And that's how those unhealthy power dynamics start to form.
Right.
The follower becomes dependent on the leader for their sense of self-worth, and the leader can exploit that dependency to control and manipulate.
So bringing this back to Chris Butler and the Science of Identity Foundation, are there signs of limerence at play there?
While some former members describe feeling a sense of awe and devotion towards Butler, viewing him as an enlightened being who held the key to their spiritual liberation. And that kind of idealization can make it difficult to question his actions or teachings, even when they might be harmful.
And we see that reflected in some of the language used in Butler's texts and teachings, right?
Yeah.
Like that quote we discussed earlier about being lower than the straw on the street. It seems like that kind of language can foster a sense of dependence and submission.
You're absolutely right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of the potential for limerence in any relationship, especially in a spiritual context where power dynamics can be more pronounced.
So how can we guard against falling into that trap? How do we know if our admiration for a teacher is healthy inspiration or veering into unhealthy limerence?
That's a great question. I think a key indicator is whether your critical thinking skills are still intact.
Okay.
Are you able to question the leader's teachings or actions? Can you disagree with them without feeling like you're betraying them or jeopardizing your spiritual progress?
So healthy admiration allows for critical thinking and respectful disagreement,
Yeah.
while limerence tends to shut those things down.
Exactly. And another sign is whether your sense of self-worth is dependent on the leader's approval.
Mm.
Do you feel like you need their validation to feel good about yourself? Or do you have a strong sense of your own inherent worth, regardless of what anyone else thinks?
It's like with healthy admiration. You can appreciate the teacher's wisdom and guidance
Right.
without becoming completely reliant on them for your sense of identity.
Precisely. And it's important to remember that true spiritual growth is an inside job.
Right.
It's not something that can be bestowed upon you by a guru or a leader. It's about cultivating your own inner wisdom, compassion, and connection to something greater than yourself.
And that takes work. It's not a passive process.
Right.
It requires self-reflection, honesty, and a willingness to face our own shadows.
I got it. And it often involves seeking guidance and support from others.
Yeah.
But it's crucial to maintain a sense of agency and to remember that ultimately we are responsible for our own spiritual evolution.
You know, it's interesting because we've been focusing a lot on the individual's responsibility to be discerning and critical.
Yeah.
But what about the broader context? Does the structure of a spiritual system itself play a role in whether it's likely to become unhealthy?
That's a really important point. The structure of a system can definitely make it more or less susceptible to certain problems.
Okay.
For example, if a group is highly hierarchical,
Right.
with a single charismatic leader at the top and little room for dissent or questioning,
Right.
that can create a breeding ground for abuse and manipulation.
Right. Because power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, as they say.
Exactly. And if the system emphasizes blind faith and obedience over critical thinking and individual discernment, that can also make people more vulnerable to unhealthy dynamics.
So if we circle back to the Science of Identity Foundation,
Hmm.
are there structural elements that might have contributed to the problems that have been alleged?
Well, based on the sources we have, it seems like the group has a fairly rigid structure, with Butler as the unquestioned authority figure.
Right.
And there's an emphasis on surrendering to his teachings and guidance without question.
Which aligns with some of the concerns raised by former members who felt pressured to conform
Yeah.
and to suppress their own doubts or critical thoughts.
Yes, and it also seems like the group might have been somewhat isolated from outside influences,
Okay.
which can make it harder for members to get a balanced perspective or
Yeah.
to seek help if they're experiencing problems.
So it sounds like a combination of individual and systemic factors
Mm-hmm.
can contribute to whether a spiritual group becomes unhealthy.
Absolutely. It's not just about the individuals involved, but also about the culture, the
Hmm.
structure, and the power dynamics within the group.
So how can a listener get a sense of whether a spiritual group has a healthy structure? What are some things they can look for?
One thing to consider is how decisions are made within the group.
Okay,
Is it a top-down approach where the leader dictates everything, or is there a more collaborative process that involves input from members at all levels?
that makes sense.
Yeah,
A healthy system would encourage participation and open communication,
right.
not just blind obedience.
Exactly. And another thing to look at is how the group handles disagreements or dissent.
Hmm.
Is there room for healthy debate and discussion? Or are people who raise concerns quickly silenced or ostracized?
That's a good point. A group that's truly confident in its teachings and its purpose shouldn't be afraid of critical thinking
Right.
or dissenting viewpoints.
You're right. In
Yeah.
fact, a diversity of perspectives can actually strengthen a group
Yeah.
and lead to greater understanding and growth.
So it's not just about avoiding groups with red flags.
Right.
It's also about seeking out groups that actively foster healthy communication, critical thinking, and a respectful approach to disagreements.
Exactly. It's
Mm.
about finding a community that supports your individual growth
Mm.
and empowers you to think for yourself,
Mm.
not one that demands unquestioning obedience or conformity.
This has been incredibly helpful in understanding how to evaluate spiritual groups and their structures. What else should our listener keep in mind as they navigate these complex waters?
Well, we've covered a lot of ground, but there are a few more things we can explore to equip our listener with even more tools for discernment.
You're right. There's always more to learn.
Yeah.
And this is definitely a journey, not a destination.
Yeah.
I think our listener is ready for a short break.
Agreed. When we come back, we'll delve deeper into the importance of personal boundaries and red flags to watch for when considering joining a spiritual group. One crucial aspect we haven't really touched on yet is personal boundaries.
Oh,
Like, this is especially important when you're thinking about joining a new spiritual group or community.
boundaries. So like setting limits on how much time you spend with the group or what kind of activities you participate in.
Exactly. Healthy spiritual groups will respect your need for, like, personal space and time.
Right.
They won't pressure you to do anything that makes you uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
But unhealthy groups often try to blur those boundaries, encouraging members to give up their autonomy and to prioritize the group's needs above their own.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
It's like if a group is truly interested in your well-being,
right.
they'll encourage you to like have a balanced life,
Yeah,
not to completely subsume your identity into the group.
right. And that can manifest in different ways.
Right.
Like, for example, they might pressure you to donate excessive amounts of money or time,
Mhm.
or they might discourage you from maintaining close relationships with family and friends outside of the group.
So if I'm feeling pressured to like cut ties with loved ones
Yeah,
or to give up my hobbies or interests, that's a major red flag.
absolutely. Healthy spiritual groups understand that people have different needs and commitments,
Right.
and they won't try to isolate you from the outside world.
You know, it's interesting because this reminds me of something we talked about earlier.
Yeah,
The idea of us versus them thinking.
right.
It seems like that mentality can really erode personal boundaries.
Yeah, you're right. Unhealthy groups often foster a sense of exclusivity, making members feel like they're special or chosen, but that specialness often comes at the cost of isolating themselves from the rest of the world.
And that isolation can make people more susceptible to manipulation and control.
Exactly. When your only source of information and support comes from within the group,
Mhm.
it's harder to see things objectively or to get help if you're experiencing problems.
So how can our listener protect themselves from getting caught in that kind of situation? What are some specific things to watch out for?
Well, one red flag is if a group discourages you from questioning their teachings
Okay.
or from seeking outside perspectives.
Right.
Healthy spiritual communities encourage critical thinking and open dialogue,
Yeah.
and they don't feel threatened by differing viewpoints.
So if a group claims to have all the answers
Right.
and discourages critical thinking, that's a sign to be wary.
Definitely. Another red flag is if a group emphasizes obedience to the leader above all else.
Right.
Healthy spiritual systems empower individuals to develop their own discernment
Mm-hmm.
and to make their own choices, not to blindly follow someone else's dictates.
Right. It's like a healthy teacher wants to help you find your own inner compass,
It's sad.
not to become your compass.
Exactly. And it's also important to be mindful of how the group handles finances.
Okay, yeah.
Are their financial practices transparent and accountable?
Right.
Or are there signs of secrecy or potential exploitation?
That's a good point. It's not necessarily a red flag if a group asks for donations.
Right.
But those requests should be reasonable,
Yeah.
and the funds should be used responsibly and ethically.
Right. And if a group pressures you to give more than you can afford,
Hmm.
or if they make financial contributions a condition of membership, that's a major warning sign.
It's a lot to keep in mind,
Yeah.
but I think it's so important to have these conversations.
Yeah.
Spiritual seeking can be a beautiful and transformative journey,
Absolutely.
but it can also be fraught with risks if we're not careful.
I agree. And it's not about being paranoid or suspicious of every group or teacher we encounter. It's about being informed, discerning, and empowered to make choices that align with our values and our well-being.
So what's the key takeaway for our listener who is trying to navigate this complex landscape and find a spiritual path that is authentic and nourishing?
I think the most important thing is to trust your own intuition
Mm-hmm.
and to be willing to ask questions. If something feels off or doesn't sit right with you,
Yeah.
don't ignore those feelings. Do your research, seek multiple perspectives,
Right?
and take your time getting to know a group or a teacher before making any major commitments.
That's great advice. And remember, it's okay to walk away if a group or a teaching doesn't feel like a good fit.
Totally.
Your spiritual journey is yours to create,
Yeah,
and you deserve to find a path that supports your growth and well-being.
absolutely. Your intuition is a powerful guide, and if you listen to it, it will steer you in the right direction.
This has been such a rich and insightful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and for helping us to navigate these complex waters.
It's been my pleasure. And remember, the journey of spiritual exploration is a lifelong adventure.
Mm-hmm.
Embrace the challenges, stay curious, and never stop seeking truth and meaning.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the world of spiritual systems. We hope this conversation has empowered you to approach your own spiritual seeking with discernment, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to your own well-being. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep growing.